The train didn't just leave her, it spat her out. One moment, the hiss of steam and the groan of steel were the only sounds in the world. The next, there was nothing but a crushing, snow-filled silence. The train was gone, a black snake slithering away into the white, leaving Iris Whitlow alone on a splintered platform in a town that had already decided she was worthless. The snow was coming down hard, not in gentle flakes, but in thick, wet clumps that clung to her thin coat and froze the hem of her dress into a brittle shell. She hugged herself, her hands numb, her breath a ghost in the frigid air. She had been waiting for 2 hours, or maybe 3. Time had become a frozen, meaningless thing. Her fiancé, Josiah Cutter, was supposed to be here. He'd sent letters filled with promises of a new life, a warm home, a future. But when word got back to him, through the twisting vines of church gossip, that she was barren, the promises turned to dust. The station master, a man with a face like crumpled leather, poked his head out of his warm little office. "Ma'am, you can't stay here all night." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were frozen in her throat, right alongside the lump of despair. Where could she go? She had spent her last coin on the ticket to this godforsaken place. A place that didn't want her. A man who didn't want her. He tapped on the glass again, his expression not unkind, but something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low hiss, barely audible over the wind. "You need to get away from here. Not just the station, this whole town." Iris looked up, confused. His eyes weren't just looking at her. They were darting around, scanning the line of snow-heavy pines that bordered the tracks. "He ain't who you think he is," the station master whispered, a puff of steam escaping his lips. "None of them are." Before she could ask what he meant, he vanished, pulling the door shut with a solid thud. The lock clicked. He had sealed himself in, and sealed her out. A new kind of cold seeped into her bones then, one that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a warning she didn't understand, the cold of a trap she had already walked into. The laughter from the saloon down the street sounded distant, alien. The warm orange glow from the windows of the town's houses felt like a personal insult. She was a ghost, invisible to the living. She sank onto the frozen bench, the wood biting into her skin even through her dress. She was going to die here. A preacher's daughter, forgotten by God, left to freeze on a train platform in the middle of nowhere. And that's when she saw him. The snow seemed to pause mid-air. The wind died down to a whisper. He didn't ride in on a horse or emerge from the town. He simply strode out of the dark woods, a giant of a man wrapped in buffalo hides, moving with a silence that was utterly unnatural. He was massive. A long black braid hung down his back, and his face, etched with lines that spoke of seasons she couldn't imagine, was set like stone. He wore no hat, and his cloak was open, revealing a chest that seemed immune to the biting cold. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They weren't like the eyes of the men back home, flickering, assessing, judging. His eyes were dark, ancient, and they didn't just look at her. They pinned her. They saw through the layers of her coat, her shame, her fear, and straight into the shivering soul beneath. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her like a collapsing mountain. He said nothing. He just watched her, his presence a heavy weight in the air. Iris found she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. This wasn't salvation. This felt like something else entirely. His gaze dropped from her face to the cracked leather suitcase at her feet, then back to her eyes. He took a step forward, then another. He reached down, not with a gentle hand, but with a grip of iron, and took the handle of her suitcase. He lifted it as if it weighed nothing. Then he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a command. "You're with me now," he said. "No choice." He turned and began walking back toward the black, silent woods he'd come from. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just expected it. Iris's mind screamed at her to run, to scream for the station master, to flee toward the false warmth of the town. But her body betrayed her. Her legs, stiff and aching, moved on their own. She stood up from the bench, and like a woman in a trance, she followed the dark figure into the trees. The lights of the station vanished behind them. The world dissolved into a disorienting maze of white snow and black trunks. The only sound was the crunch of their boots, a lonely rhythm in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. She had been left by one man, only to be taken by another, and she had a horrifying, sinking feeling that she had just traded a cold, lonely death for something far, far worse. Who was this man? Where was he taking her? The question echoed in the silent woods, but the only answer was the steady, relentless pace of the giant leading her deeper into the unknown. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The snow grew deeper, the silence more profound. Iris's lungs burned with every breath, and her legs felt like lead. Several times she stumbled, her frozen dress tripping her up, but she always forced herself back to her feet. The man never slowed down. He never looked back. It was clear he didn't care if she kept up. He was simply moving, and she was the object he was transporting. Finally, through the swirling snow, she saw it. A cabin, tucked against a rock face, looking less like a home and more like a part of the mountain itself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the dark sky. It was the only sign of life for miles. He pushed the heavy wooden door open without a key and gestured for her to enter. She hesitated on the threshold, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. The air inside smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling. But the cold was too much. It was a physical pain, a monster chewing on her bones. She took a staggering step inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. A fire roared in a large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the single room. It was a Spartan place. A rough-hewn table, a cot in the corner, and shelves lined with tools she didn't recognize. But as her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, she saw things that made the hair on her arms stand up. On a small stool near the fire sat a half-mended shawl. It was a delicate thing, made of fine wool, the kind a woman of some means might wear. It wasn't hers. And on the table, next to a single empty bowl, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a child's toy. Her blood ran cold. He wasn't a hermit. Someone else lived here, or had lived here. Was Iris a guest, or was she a replacement? The man, Wakana, as he would later name himself, placed her suitcase by the door. He didn't look at her. He moved to the fire and ladled a thick, meaty stew into the empty bowl on the table. He pushed it toward the empty chair, an invitation, or an order. She didn't move. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the shawl, the toy, the unnerving silence of her host. Was there a woman locked in another room? A child hidden away? Eat, he said. The word was flat, devoid of emotion. Her stomach growled, a traitor to her fear. She hadn't eaten in what felt like days. Hesitantly, she moved to the table and sat down. She picked up the spoon with trembling fingers and took a bite. The stew was hot, rich, and she devoured it like a starving animal, not daring to look up at the man who watched her from across the room. He didn't eat. He just stood by the fire, a silent, imposing statue of a man, his shadow stretching across the floor. When she finished, he took the bowl, rinsed it in a bucket of water, and placed it back on the shelf. No words, no explanation. He gestured toward the cot. Sleep. She looked at the simple bed, then back at him. And you? She whispered, her voice cracking. He simply picked up a thick buffalo hide from the floor, wrapped it around his shoulders, and sat in the chair by the door, blocking the only exit. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and laid it across his lap. He wasn't going to sleep. He was going to watch. Iris lay down on the cot, pulling a thin, scratchy blanket over herself. She didn't dare take off her coat. She lay there, stiff as a board, her back to the room, her ears straining for every sound. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside, and from the chair by the door came the soft, rhythmic sound of a knife blade being sharpened against a whetstone. Sleep was impossible. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror. The station master's warning, the woman's shawl, the child's toy. It was all a puzzle she couldn't solve. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the night, exhaustion finally claimed her. But her sleep was not restful. It was filled with nightmares of being chased through a snowy forest, of a woman with no face, and a small wooden bird that wept tears of blood. She awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with a gray pre-dawn light. She sat up, her eyes immediately darting to the chair by the door. It was empty. Wakana was gone. For a moment, a wild, desperate hope surged through her. She could run. She could grab her suitcase and flee back toward the town, back toward a danger she at least understood. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her boots hitting the cold floorboards with a soft thud. She stood up, her eyes scanning the small cabin, and that's when she saw them. On the shelf above the hearth, where she hadn't noticed them before, were more carvings. Dozens of them. They weren't just birds or animals. They were figures, people. A man chopping wood, a child running, and woman after woman after woman. Some were standing, some were sitting, and one, tucked away in the back, was a carving of a woman lying face down in the snow, her hair fanned out around her like a dark halo. The carving was so detailed, so lifelike, that Iris could almost feel the cold seeping into her own body. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just art. This was a story, a collection. And as she looked closer at the faces of the carved women, a horrifying realization dawned on her. They all had different features, different clothes, but they all had her hair, her nose, her chin. It was like looking at a collection of ghosts of herself. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Wakana stood on the threshold, his silhouette blocking the morning light. He held a freshly caught rabbit in one hand. He saw her staring at the shelf, his eyes following her gaze to the chilling collection of figures. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied, as if she had finally understood. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. He looked from the carvings to her, and then he gave her the smallest, most terrifying smile she had ever seen. "You see," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper, "you are not the first." Iris's world tilted on its axis. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating, the stew in her stomach like a lump of lead. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a replacement. She was a piece in a collection. Her mind reeled, grasping for an explanation that didn't end with her as another lifeless wooden figure on a dusty shelf. Who were these other women? Were they real? Had they all been brought here, just like her, from that lonely train platform? "Who are they?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. Wakana set the rabbit down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up his knife, the same one he'd held all night, and began to skin the animal with practiced, efficient strokes. He didn't answer her. The only sound was the slick, tearing noise of the blade. Iris backed away, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes were glued to the carvings, to the woman in the snow. Was that her fate? To be his muse, his model, before he discarded her like the rabbit's pelt? She had to get out. Now. While his back was turned, she darted for the door. Her hand was on the rough wooden latch when his voice stopped her, cold and sharp. "The town will not help you." She froze, her fingers trembling on the wood. "What do you mean?" He turned his head, his dark eyes fixing her with an unnerving intensity. "Josiah did not simply leave you. He delivered you." It was like being punched in the gut. The air rushed out of her lungs. "No," she breathed. "He wouldn't. He loved me." A short, bitter laugh escaped Wakana's lips. It was a terrible sound. "The men in that town, They have a way of cleaning house. They find women who are unwanted, broken, alone. They make promises, bring them here, and then they leave them for the cold, for the wolves. He paused, wiping his blade on a cloth. Or for me. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place, forming a picture more horrific than she could have ever imagined. Josiah's sweet letters, the station master's fear, the town's neat, orderly rows of houses with their dark secrets hidden behind glowing windows. It was a system, a disposal system for human beings. They kill them? She asked, her voice trembling. They call it letting God sort them out, Wakana said. The preacher gives it a pretty name, says it keeps the town pure. He gestured with his knife toward the shelf of carvings. They were all like you, full of hope, waiting on a platform for a man who was never coming. Iris sank to her knees, the floorboards cold against her skin. She had been sentenced to death without ever knowing she was on trial, and Josiah, the man she had promised to spend her life with, had been her executioner. Why? She sobbed, the tears finally breaking free. Why are you telling me this? Why did you save me? Wakana finished with the rabbit and walked toward her. He crouched down, his massive frame looming over her. She flinched, expecting a blow, but he didn't touch her. Because my wife was the first, he said, his voice raw with an ancient pain. He pointed a long finger at the carving of the woman in the snow. They took her from me, years ago. The preacher said she was a savage, that she tainted their perfect little world. They left her in a blizzard, just a mile from this cabin. The story hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't a monster. He was a man consumed by grief, a collector of ghosts. The carvings weren't trophies of his kills, they were memorials to theirs. I find them now, he continued, his voice dropping to a low growl. Before the snow can. I give them a choice they were never given, a warm fire, a full belly. And then what? Iris whispered, her eyes wide with a terrifying new question. What happened to them after the fire and the food? Where were they now? Wakana stood up, his face an unreadable mask. He looked down at her, a strange light in his eyes. Some, I help move on. To another town, another life. Some stay. He walked over to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room, one she hadn't paid much attention to. He lifted the heavy lid. Iris scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She crept closer, peering over the edge. The chest wasn't filled with blankets or tools. It was filled with dresses, bonnets, worn-out shoes, a collection of belongings from the women who had come before her, a trunk of lost lives. And at the very top, lying on a folded calico dress, was a leather-bound journal. Wakana reached in and picked it up. He held it out to her. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond grief and anger. She saw a glimmer of hope. Her name was Anna, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was the last one. She knew how to write. She figured it all out. The preacher, Josiah, the whole damn town. He pushed the journal into Iris's hands. She was going to expose them. Iris looked down at the journal. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. What? What happened to her? She asked, dreading the answer. Wakana's face darkened. The hope vanished, replaced by a storm of fury. She disappeared, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. One day she went into town to buy ink, and she never came back. That was 3 months ago. He looked from the journal in her hands to the door, a plan beginning to form in his eyes. A dangerous, reckless plan. They took her, he said. But they didn't get this. He tapped the journal. They don't know it exists. They think the secret is safe. He looked back at Iris, and she realized the choice he had offered wasn't just about staying or leaving. It was about something more. The story needs an ending, he said, his eyes burning into hers. Anna started it. You will finish it. He wasn't just offering her survival. He was offering her revenge. The journal felt heavy in her hands, a testament of ghosts. Iris spent the rest of the day by the fire, turning the delicate, brittle pages of Anna's diary. Wakana left her alone, moving about the cabin with his usual quiet intensity, but she could feel his eyes on her, waiting. Anna's handwriting was neat, precise. She was a schoolteacher from back east, another woman lured by the promise of a life that turned out to be a lie. Her words painted a chilling picture, confirming everything Wakana had said. She named names. The preacher, Reverend Miller, was the architect of the town's purification. Josiah Cutter was his prize student, his willing instrument. She wrote about the whispers, the shunning, the way the town would slowly suffocate the life out of any woman deemed unsuitable. It was a quiet kind of violence, one that left no bruises. But Anna was different. She hadn't broken. She had started to fight back. She meticulously documented every suspicious disappearance, every veiled threat. She had collected evidence. She described a hidden ledger kept by the station master, a secret record of all the women who had arrived in town but never officially left. The last entry was dated 3 months ago. I have enough now. I'm going into town for more ink and one last piece of proof. Josiah has been careless. He spoke to the wrong person. The station master is afraid, but I think his conscience is winning. I will confront the Reverend on Sunday, in front of the whole congregation. God will not be mocked in his own house. They will not silence another one of us. But they had. They had silenced her. Iris closed the journal, a cold, hard resolve settling in her heart. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Anna. It was about the woman in the carving. It was about every faceless figure on Wakana's shelf. She looked up at him. He was watching her, his face grim. They have to pay, she said, her voice clear and steady. A flicker of something, approval, maybe even pride, passed through his eyes. The ledger, he said. The station master. That's the key. He tried to warn me, Iris remembered. He was afraid. He has reason to be, Wakana said darkly. Reverend Miller holds this town in a grip of fear. But Anna was right. He's a man of conscience, buried under years of turning a blind eye. A plan began to form between them, unspoken but understood. It was insane. It was dangerous, but it was the only path forward. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. The only way out was through. On Sunday, Iris said, the words tasting like iron and ash in her mouth. Just as Anna planned. For the next few days, a strange new rhythm settled in the cabin. It was the rhythm of a coming war. Wakana taught her how to use a small knife, how to move silently through the trees. He showed her paths and trails she never would have found on her own. He wasn't just protecting her, he was arming her. She, in turn, read Anna's journal over and over, memorizing the names, the dates, the details. She was no longer just Iris Whitlow, the abandoned bride. She was the vessel of Anna's fury, the executor of her will. On Saturday evening, the air in the cabin was thick with tension. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. Tomorrow, they would walk into the heart of the beast. You don't have to do this, Wakana said, his voice low. It was the first time he had expressed any doubt. I can take you north. You can disappear. Start over. Iris looked up from the fire. She thought of the woman on the platform, freezing and hopeless. She thought of the carving in the snow. She thought of Anna's brave, final words. They didn't let Anna start over, she said simply. They don't get to decide who lives and who dies. Not anymore. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a page she had carefully torn from the back of Anna's journal. On it, she had copied a single damning paragraph detailing Josiah's role. This is for him, she said. He needs to know that we know. Wakana nodded slowly. He understood. This wasn't just about justice. It was about tearing down their righteous facade piece by piece. But as Iris tucked the paper away, her hand brushed against something else in her pocket. A small, wooden object. She pulled it out. It was a carving, one she hadn't seen before. It must have been slipped into her pocket by Wakana at some point. It was a hawk, its wings spread wide, ready for flight. But one of its wings had a small chip on the edge, a tiny imperfection. She looked at Wakana, a question in her eyes. "Wind broke the wing," he said, his voice rough. "Then why carve it mid-flight?" she asked. His dark eyes met hers, and the meaning was as clear as the winter sky. "Still flies." A lump formed in her throat. He saw her, not as a broken thing, a barren woman, a victim. He saw her as a survivor, a hawk with a broken wing that still had the strength to soar. But as she clutched the small bird in her hand, a new, chilling thought crept into her mind. Wakana had been watching this town for years. He knew its secrets, its routines. He knew about the ledger. He knew Anna was going to confront the preacher. Why hadn't he stopped her? Why had he let her walk into that trap alone? The trust she had begun to build in him wavered, replaced by a sliver of ice-cold suspicion. Was he telling her everything? Or was he, like everyone else in this twisted place, using her for his own purposes? The doubt must have shown on her face. "She was stubborn," Wakana said quietly, as if reading her mind. "She wouldn't listen. She trusted in her God to protect her. She believed the truth would be enough." His voice turned bitter. "I told her it wouldn't be." He had tried to save Anna, and he had failed. The weight of that failure was etched into every line on his face. He wasn't just seeking justice for his wife. He was seeking redemption for the woman he couldn't save. And now, Iris was his second chance. The weight of that realization settled on her shoulders, heavier than any winter coat. This wasn't just her fight. She was carrying the hopes of all the dead. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice firm, pushing the doubt away. "We end it." Sunday morning arrived, crisp and unnaturally bright. The snow on the ground glittered, a blanket of diamonds hiding the darkness beneath. Iris braided her hair, tucking the small wooden hawk into the folds. It was a secret source of strength. She and Wakana walked down the mountain together, not as captor and captive, but as allies. They didn't speak. Every word that needed to be said had already passed between them. The town was quiet when they arrived, the only sound the distant, mocking chime of the church bell. Heads turned as they walked down the main street. Whispers followed them like smoke. They didn't see her as a woman who had survived. They saw her as a disgrace, a fallen creature tainted by the savage who walked beside her. She saw Josiah standing near the general store, his face pale and pinched. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger when he saw her. He looked from her to Wakana, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. "Good," she thought. "Be afraid." They didn't stop. They walked straight to the church and without hesitating, pushed open the heavy oak doors. The hymn died in the throats of the congregation. Every face in the pews turned toward them, a sea of shock and outrage. At the front, standing behind the pulpit, Reverend Miller's jaw went slack. His carefully constructed world was cracking at the seams. Iris's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze locking onto Josiah. He looked like he was about to be sick. She walked forward, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. Wakana remained by the door, a silent, imposing guard. She didn't take a seat in the back. She walked all the way to the front pew, the one usually reserved for the town elders, and sat down. She unfolded the piece of paper from her pocket. Reverend Miller recovered himself, his face hardening into a mask of righteous fury. "This is a house of God," he boomed. "You are not welcome here, girl, not with him." He spat the word out like poison. Iris didn't look at the preacher. She looked at Josiah. She held up the piece of paper, the damning words of a dead woman. "I believe this belongs to you, Josiah," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent church. Josiah's face went white as a sheet. He looked from the paper to the preacher, his eyes wide with panic. "It's a lie!" he stammered. "Whatever she's told you, it's a lie! She's a sinner, a barren whore who's been living in the woods with an Indian." The congregation gasped. Old Martha Green, the town's chief gossip, looked like she might faint with morbid delight. "I may be a sinner," Iris said, her voice rising cold and clear. But I am not a murderer. She stood up and started to read from the page. Anna's words, a voice from the grave, filled the sacred space. She described the plot to lure her to the town, the false promises, the final, chilling instruction from Josiah to simply wait at the station. With every word, the preacher's face grew darker, his knuckles white where he gripped the pulpit. The congregation began to murmur, looking back and forth between the terrified Josiah and their stoic leader. But before Iris could finish, the church doors burst open again. It was the station master. He was breathless, his face pale, but his eyes were blazing with a newfound courage. In his hands, he clutched a thick, dusty ledger. "She's telling the truth!" he yelled, his voice shaking but loud. "It's all in here! All of them! 20 years of it! Miller's been doing this for years!" Chaos erupted. The preacher's mask of piety shattered, revealing the monster beneath. "Lies, all of them! Seize them!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Iris, Wakana, and the station master. A few men from the front pews, his loyal deacons, stood up, their faces grim. They started to advance. Wakana moved from the doorway, not with aggression, but with a fluid, deadly grace. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to make the first two men hesitate. But then Josiah, in a fit of pure panic, did something no one expected. He lunged, not at Iris, but at the station master, trying to wrestle the ledger away from him. "Give me that!" he screamed. The station master stumbled backward, tripping over a pew. The ledger flew from his hands, skidding across the polished floor. It landed at the foot of the pulpit, right at Reverend Miller's feet. For a moment, everyone froze. The preacher looked down at the book, the physical proof of his decades of sin. His eyes were wild. He knew it was over. His reign of terror, his clean little town, it was all about to be washed away in a flood of truth. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of his flock, the people he had ruled through fear. He saw their doubt. He saw their judgment. And he snapped. With a guttural roar, he kicked the ledger away. "It means nothing!" he screamed. He grabbed the heavy golden cross from the altar, brandishing it like a weapon. "The Lord will be my judge, not you. I cleansed this town. I kept it pure." He lunged forward, not toward Iris or Wakana, but toward the side door of the church. He was trying to escape, but Wakana was faster. He moved like a shadow, intercepting the preacher before he could reach the door. He didn't touch him. He simply stood in his way, an immovable mountain of silent judgment. The preacher skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. He looked into Wakana's cold, dark eyes, and in them he saw the ghost of a woman left to die in the snow. He saw 2 decades of his own evil reflected back at him. He let out a choked sob and collapsed to his knees, the golden cross clattering to the floor. It was over. The silence that fell over the church was absolute, broken only by the sound of the preacher's ragged weeping. The townspeople just stood there, stunned, looking at the man they had followed blindly, now exposed as a monster. They looked at Josiah, cowering by a pew. They looked at Iris, standing tall and unbroken, and they looked at the native man who had brought their whole rotten world crashing down. Iris walked over and picked up the ledger. She held it not as a weapon, but as a memorial. "My name is Iris Whitlow," she said, her voice steady and strong, filling the entire church. "And I was not the first. But thanks to Anna, and to him," she nodded toward Wakana, "I will be the last." She turned, walked past the rows of stunned, shamed faces, and didn't stop until she was outside in the bright, clean sunlight. Wakana was right behind her. They didn't look back. The story wasn't over. Justice was not the same as peace. The preacher was locked in the town jail, awaiting a circuit judge who would surely see him hang. Josiah Cutter, broken and disgraced, had vanished in the night, a coward to the very end. The town was reeling, forced to look at the ugliness they had allowed to fester in their midst. But the silence that followed was not a comfortable one. Iris and Wakana returned to the cabin on the mountain. But the victory felt hollow. The ghosts were quiet now, but the world was not. Word of what happened in the church spread like wildfire. To the neighboring towns, Iris was a hero, a symbol of resilience. But to the people of this town, she was a reminder of their shame. And shame often curdles into hate. They started to see signs. A dead raven left on their path, a symbol of bad omens. A bundle of sticks tied in a strange knot, a warning. The townsfolk who had once whispered now stared with open hostility. They blamed her, they blamed Wakana. They had torn open the belly of their community, and now they couldn't stand the stench. One evening, as dusk was settling, Wakana returned from checking his traps, his face grim. "They're coming," he said, his voice low and tight. Iris's heart dropped. Who? The rest of them. The ones who believed the preacher. The ones who think we defiled their town. He began to bar the door, his movements quick and efficient. They aren't coming to talk. The quiet peace of the cabin evaporated, replaced by the chilling certainty of another fight. This wasn't about a single preacher anymore. This was about the poison he had left behind in the hearts of his followers. Soon, they heard it. The crunch of many boots in the snow, the low murmur of angry voices, then, the flicker of torches through the trees. It wasn't just a few angry men. It was a mob. Iris's blood ran cold. She looked at Wakana. There was no fear in his eyes, only a grim determination. He handed her a knife. "Stay away from the window," he commanded. The first rock shattered the small window pane, sending a spray of glass and freezing air into the cabin. A voice from the crowd roared, "Come out, savage! Give us the witch!" Wakana stood in the center of the room, a silent, powerful presence. Iris flattened herself against the far wall, her heart hammering, the knife slick with sweat in her hand. This was it. This was how it ended. Trapped in a cabin, surrounded by a wall of hate. But then, a new sound cut through the angry shouts of the mob, a gunshot. It wasn't aimed at the cabin, it was fired into the air. The mob fell silent, their torches casting a nervous flickering light on the trees. A figure stepped out of the woods, holding a smoking rifle. It was the station master, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were half a dozen men from the next town over, grim-faced farmers and ranchers, all armed. "That's enough!" the station master yelled, his voice carrying a new authority. "This ain't your town to cleanse anymore. This woman and this man. They did what none of you had the courage to do. They told the truth." The mob hesitated, their righteous fury faltering in the face of armed opposition. The leader, one of Miller's old deacons, spat on the ground. "This ain't your business, old man." "I'm making it my business," the station master retorted. He took a step forward, the rifle held steady. "Now get off this mountain before you join your preacher on the gallows." The standoff was thick with tension. For a long moment, no one moved. The deacon stared down the barrel of the rifle, his face contorted with hate. Then, slowly, he lowered his torch. The fight went out of him. One by one, the others followed suit, turning and melting back into the dark woods, their shameful crusade a failure. Inside the cabin, Iris let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She sagged against the wall, the knife clattering from her hand. Wakana unbarred the door. The station master stood there, his face weary but resolute. "Figured you could use some neighbors," he said with a wry smile. Wakana simply nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. From that day on, things began to change. The town below remained a place of quiet shame, but the world around it had shifted. The story of the preacher and the woman who exposed him became a local legend. People from other settlements would make the trek up the mountain, not to stare, but to bring gifts: a sack of flour, a jar of preserves, a bolt of cloth. They were offerings of respect. Iris found she was no longer just a survivor. She was a pillar, a story. One spring afternoon, as the last of the snow was melting from the high peaks, she sat with Wakana outside the cabin, mending one of his shirts. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sense of peace, a real, lasting peace. She finished her stitch and looked at the collection of carvings Wakana had brought out into the sun, the silent women on the shelf. "What will you do with them?" she asked quietly. He picked up the figure of the woman in the snow, his wife. He held it gently in his large, calloused hands. "They are free now," he said. That evening they built a large fire. One by one, Wakana took the carvings of the women, all of them except the one of his wife, and placed them into the flames. They watched as the fire consumed them, releasing their wooden forms from their silent vigil. It wasn't an act of destruction. It was a funeral, a release. When the last figure had turned to ash, Wakana looked at Iris. The firelight danced in his eyes. "Their story is told," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new carving. It was two figures standing side by side, a man and a woman. Their hands weren't touching, but they were facing the same direction, looking out at the world together. He placed it in her hand. Iris looked down at the carving, then up at him. She saw no more ghosts in his eyes, no more grief. She saw a man who had finally found his own peace. She leaned forward and for the first time rested her head against his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, solid and warm as the mountain itself. The fire crackled, the stars came out, and below them, the world was quiet. Her name was Iris. His was Wakana. They were two broken wings that together had finally learned to fly. And their story, born from snow and silence, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets are buried just waiting to be uncovered.